students, and welcome to week 13, where we're going to be talking about grading and reporting. We're almost at the end of the semester, and so you should definitely make sure to listen to the other lecture as well, which is about the final examination. Grading is an important part of assessing students, and grading is the process of judging the quality of a student's performance on a single assessment or multiple assessments over time. What you're trying to do is translate numeric scores and descriptions into marks or letters that indicate the quality of a student's performance. This is less of a practice in younger years and more so as students get older. Usually by middle or late elementary school, students are getting grades. Assigning grades to students is an exceptionally important professional responsibility with many consequences for students, and I would also say for you, the teacher. What are some of the purposes of grading? Well, they fall out into different classifications. What you see here on this slide are the administrative purposes of grading. So for example, grades can help determine a high school student's rank in class, credits for graduation, suitability for promotion to the next grade. It enables the principal or administrator to judge your teaching approaches to see how students are doing and to judge the quality of teachers and administrators. There are also informational purposes of grading to inform someone. Grades inform parents, students, and others about a student's academic performance and effort or lack of effort. There is a cautionary note here. You can't just go informing everyone willy-nilly. You should only share grades on a need-to-know basis. And really, mostly it breaks out to the parent, the student, obviously, and sometimes other personnel in the school, such as the school psychologist, guidance counselor who might be a part of a team to do, for example, an IEP, sometimes the principal or assistant principal. Beyond that, once you start sharing grades, for example, with other students, that would be inappropriate. With other students' parents, that would be especially inappropriate. So use caution and discretion about sharing students' grades. Grades represent your summary judgment about whether students have mastered the content and processes. And they are summative assessments, so they're not formative in nature usually. They're to say what students did or did not learn. They're usually at the end of a marking period or some other discretionary time unit. There are a few motivational purposes of grading. So for example, you can use grades to judge the level of student effort and to reward good motivation. Parents do this all the time. If you get an A, I'm going to give you a treat, for example. But you can use grades to motivate parents to improve a student's effort. And the cautionary note here is grades should not be used for motivational purposes only, because they don't work with all students, and students need to know that grades mean something besides getting a treat. High grades tend to motivate students, whereas low grades do not typically motivate students to do better. They, in fact, have the opposite effect, which is to discourage students. A word about grading and punishment. Grading should never be a form of punishment. You should not say to students, for example, if everybody doesn't pass this test, I'm going to take away recess. We know that this is problematic in very many ways. It causes students to withdraw even more rather than to motivating them to work harder. The guidance purposes of grading, they help students, parents, and counselors to choose appropriate courses and levels, and they help teachers to group students by level of performance, strength, or need. As a teacher, you should work to devise a grading system that is fair, obviously, and you're going to have to be able to defend that fairness to parents and to administrators, and also a system that delivers the message about students' performance that you wish to convey. We deal with many difficulties of grading. So uh, you want to be not a friend, that's not the right word, but supportive of your students. And sometimes when you're giving grades, that can come on as very authoritarianism and will actually work against that role. But it's a necessary task to grade. Um, Another difficulty is there are lots and lots of circumstances that students may be involved with that either you know or don't know about, and it may distort the grade or distort your judgment about the grade. And we're all humans, and so if um, if you have a student, for example, who is particularly aggressive towards you, that's a characteristic. You might tend to grade that student a little more harshly than other students. Grading itself is very subjective. You might grade one student higher and one student lower without meaning to. So that's why we try to use rubrics and other things that make it more objective. Many teachers lack formal training on grading, and so that can become a problem. And throughout our field of education, there's a lack of universally accepted strategies for grading. Let's consider some problematic aspects of training. For example, suppose you have a student, Jamal, who just got a 95 on a test. Well, you might think that's a good grade, but really, what does that mean? It could be 95 out of 100 possible points, and that would be a really good grade. Or it could be 95 out of 1,000 points, and that would be a very, very low grade, probably a failing grade. So all grading involves a comparison to something. In this case, in the case of the example I gave you, it's how many possible points are there? 100 points. Um, it could be a comparison to someone, as we are talking about normative tests later on, we'll see. So it's a comparison. So you have to ask yourself, is a score of 95 excellent, average, or poor? And you have to ask yourself, what further information do we need to determine the quality of the score? Some form of comparison is needed to make a judgment. So there are a number of comparisons we can make. We can compare the student's performance to the performance of other students. And we call this norm-referenced grading. We can compare the student performance to some standards, some predefined standards of good or poor performance, rather than comparing them with other students. And we call this criterion-referenced grading. These are important terms to know. As a teacher, you'll be expected to know them. We can compare the student's performance to his own ability level. So where is he in his, if you have a very advanced student, for example, and he only got a C on a test, is he really living up to his ability? And you can even compare the student's performance to improvement based on his past performance. So some IEPs actually do this. They actually have you compare and chart progress over time. The two most common ways to grade, though, are either norm referenced or criterion referenced. So let's discuss that a little bit further. As we said, assigning grades to students based on a comparison with other students is a norm referenced. Sometimes we call this relative grading. You might have heard it grading on the curve. You can do this in your class. So for example, suppose you give a series of assignments and tests and nobody gets, if you were to use a grading scale and average them all, nobody gets a very high score. And so what are you going to give all your students D's and C's? Or are you going to take a look at your assignments and say, maybe it was too hard, or maybe I didn't provide enough scaffolding and I need to grade this on the curve? So what you could do there is you could say, okay, I'm going to take the top 20% of students' grades and give them an A. I can give the next 30% a B, And you get to set the percentages, by the way. Next 30% is C, and rank order them from top to bottom and just say, okay, if I've got 30 students in my class, I would give 20% of 30 students, and that would be 6 students. 6 of the top scorers get an A. And then 30% of 30 is 9 students, so 9 students get a B. Another one, you could use different percentages. Top 10% get an A, next 40% get a B. So this is one type of norm referenced grading where you compare their scores with each other. Well, why is it called norm referenced? Well, because it's based on, if you've had any statistics, something called the normal curve. And what this curve that you see in front of you is the normal curve. It's shaped like a bell, and it's high at the top, the peak, and it's low on the ends. And what that represents is the distribution of all the possible people in their scores in the middle. So most people will get an average score and represented by that 50% line, which is C. And then as you go up, fewer people will get higher grades and fewer people will get lower grades. And so without getting into a lot of statistics, what that means is this is the normal curve. And so you would expect these patterns to occur in your grading. And so you're basing it on the normal curve. It's norm referenced. There's some advantages and some limitations with norm reference grading. Obviously, the advantages are you get to rank the students, it influences effort and attitude, and it motivates students to compete with each other. Limitations are you're going to have students who repeatedly score near the bottom of the class. And so even if their score improves, they're not going to get a higher letter grade. It can also make students reduce cooperation and collaboration because they don't want to help people get better grades because they're competing against them for a spot in, for example, the top 10%, and not all students can get A's. Now, in addition to norm referencing things in your classroom, you can also see a number of standardized tests or norm referenced. For example, the California Achievement Test, the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, the Scholastic Aptitude Test or the SATs, a number of intelligence tests, including the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. And what these test developers do is they pilot questions and they develop a test and they give it to a lot of people, tens of thousands of people. And then they see how the scores break out. What's the average score, what's a high score, what's a low score. And then when your students take the test, they're going to compare your student's score against that big group. So your student might score, for example, in the 60th percentile, which would be above average, against that large group. A different type of grading, and this is probably the most commonly used by teachers in their classroom, is a criterion-referenced or absolute grading, sometimes called absolute. And this is, you don't compare students' scores. Instead, you compare their performance to some pre-established performance standards. And what you do there, as we've been doing in class, is you have to define the level or score that a student must attain to receive a particular grade. In this model, all students could get A's if they come up to that level. So examples, suppose you have students and they all get between 90 and 100% on a test, then they're all going to get A's. A number of strengths. Any student who scores within one of the above performance standards will get the corresponding grade. All students can get A's. It can promote cooperative learning because students are not competing against each other for grades. Other students' scores do not affect their score. However, it doesn't allow for comparisons to others, so you don't really know how students are doing. Are they doing better or worse than each other? And each student is graded based on his or her performance. Some examples of standardized criterion tests, most state tests, so all the New York State tests say, okay, did the student master this learning standard? Reading assessment test, did the student master, the use of phonics? Math assessment test, did the student master two-digit multiplication by two-digit multiplication? And almost all the testing that you do in your own class is probably going to be criterion testing because most of you won't be norming scores. So when you're in the classroom, you must decide what to grade. And the idea is you don't want to grade everything. First of all, it's an incredible amount of work on you. And second of all, it's not necessary. So you have to decide what you want to grade. So you think about, well, what do I want my grades to convey about student performance? Maybe you're going to choose to grade a test or a final exam, and also you're going to choose to grade a poster project, and you're going to mix it up and do lots of different types of grades. You're going to think about what types of behavior performances you want to promote or discourage, and if the assessments you've included in the grade reflect what you want to convey. You draw on multiple types of information. So if you think about this course, I've taken a lot of grades from you. For example, there was your quiz project, there was your formative assessment project, there's going to be a final examination, discussions weekly. And so this sort of is an advantage because students who don't test well have an opportunity to shine in other ways. If you're grading based on affective, so feelings and attitudes, they should not be major factors in report card grades. Use discretion when grading. So grading is a human judgmental process. Teachers know their students as whole persons, not one-dimensional scorers or achievers. And determining how to incorporate specific information into a grade requires professional discretion that you'll get better at as you teach more. So try not to be so lockstep with a grading scale if you think it's warranted. Describe your grading procedures to students at the beginning of instruction and make it clear that the course grade will not be based on you giving them a grade so much as them earning it, achieving it. This is something I find is really helpful and important. As students get older especially, they tend to think if they're nice to the teacher will give them a good grade. And they don't really understand that grades are earned. And so you need to kind of step through how you calculate their grades. You need to explain how other elements, such as effort or work habits, will be reported on or factored in if they are. In other words, communication is the key here. And you need to relate your grading procedures both to the students and to the parents. One thing that's really important is to return all assessment results. In other words, grade as quickly as possible. Don't leave it hanging out there for 6 weeks because students will have forgotten the assignment. I like, as you know, to offer second chances, but not everyone will do that. Properly weight the various types of assessments to be included in the grade. So not everything has to be weighted equally. You might say, well, content knowledge is the most important thing here, and you might weight that more importantly than a writing quiz. Be fair, avoid bias, and when in doubt, review the evidence. We're all human beings, and as I said, you might have to go through your papers and say, am I grading all the students fairly? You might even grade them anonymously where you don't look at the names. Let's discuss now how to calculate grades for a test or a quiz. When you're doing this, it's best to calculate grades not only for the overall test or quiz, but to understand how students are really doing. You need to calculate scores based also on learning objectives. First, decide how much you want to count each objectives, how much each one is going to be worth. And if they're not all counted equally, you should have a reason. For example, You might decide you've spent 80% of your time on the first objective and only 20% on the second objective. Let's see an example. Suppose you're a math teacher and you have two objectives that you've been working on. Objective 1 says students will be able to divide a 3-digit number by a 2-digit number. You're going to make that worth 50% of the test. Objective 2 says students will be able to complete a word problem using division and explain what to do with the remainder. And you're going to count that worth 50% of the test. Again, you wouldn't have to weight them equally, but to keep it simple, let's say you are. Now you decide to give a 10-question quiz or test. Items 1 through 10, and you can see the first 5 items, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, cover the first learning objective, and items 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, the same number, 5 items, cover the second. Let's say a student scored out of 10 points, each item was worth 10 points. So item 1 was worth 10 points, item 2 was worth 10 points, and so on. And these are the scores for one student. He got a 9 on the first item, an 8 on the second item, a 9, etc. If you add all those up, he got an 80, which let's say is a B-. That would tell you how he did overall, but it wouldn't tell you how he scored on the first objective. So if you add all of the items up for the first objective, items 1 through 5, you'd see he got a 43. If you add his scores up on items 6 through 10, you see he got a 37. So he did better on the first objective. He got a 43 on the first one. He got a 37 on the second one. So he might need a little more help on objective 2, the word problem. You also need to think how you would combine grades. So you're not going to give just one grade this semester. So you might say, okay, my tests are going to count for half, 50%, my quizzes for 25%, and I'm going to do a portfolio, and that's going to count for 25%. These are just examples of something you could do. You could do lots of other things. And let's say you have 2 students in your class. Student A got a 95 on the test out of 100, a 90 on the quiz, and an 80 on the portfolio. Student B got an 80 on the test, an 85 on the quiz, and a 90 on the portfolio. Well, how are you going to calculate their grades? You can't just add them up because the test is what counts for more of the grade than the other things. So yes, there's a little bit of math involved, but I'll try to make it as painless as possible. Look at student A on the bottom. He got a 95 on his test, and that counts for half the grade. So we can multiply it by a decimal 0.5 to get the proper weighting for half. 95 times 0.5 means he earned 47.5 points out of a possible 50 on his test. Quizzes, on the other hand, only count for 25%. So we're going to take his score, 90, and multiply it by the decimal 0.25 for 25, and that gives us 22.5 points. He got an 80 on the portfolio, and that counts for 25%, so we're going to take the score 80 times, the asterisks mean times in case you're confused, 0.25 for the 25%, and that gives him 20. So he earned 47.5 points on tests, 22.5 on quizzes, and 20 on portfolios. If you add all that up, he got a 90. Similarly, student B on the right got an 80 on the test, so we're going to multiply that times 0.5 for 50%. He earned 40 points on tests. 85 on a quiz times 25% or 0.25 gives him 21.3 points. 90 on portfolio times 0.25 for 25% is 22.5 points. If you add all those scores up, student B got an 83.8. This would be the grading average. Then you could simply have a grading scale like I do in the syllabus. Remember, student A got a 90, so what would a 90 be? Look at this grading scale. You see it falls in the A minus range. So student A got an A minus. Student B got an 83.8. You could round it up if you are feeling generous and give an 84 for a B. So I often round up if it's that close. Now this week, you have to do a grading and reporting assignment that's very similar to what we just did. It's worth 1 course point and it's due on Sunday. The worksheet is in the folder. Next week, you'll have your fieldwork assignment that's due. And so please feel free to email me if you have any questions. Everybody have a good week.